Night falls upon a world long vanished, and yet still alive within our collective memory. Imagine the soft crackle of torchlight dancing along the crumbling stones of an ancient fortress. The moon hangs heavy in a sky of silent silver, casting pale shadows over damp cobblestones and timbered roofs. Beneath that quiet stillness lies a realm ruled not by knights, nor kings, nor priests, but by an army unseen. For while history speaks of warriors in gleaming armor and banners fluttering in the wind, there were other soldiers, smaller, quieter, and infinitely more patient, who shaped the fate of empires without ever raising a sword. They scurried beneath floorboards, lurked in grain stores, and nested in the rafters of great halls. They did not march to the sound of drums, yet they accompanied every army. They claimed no territory, yet they conquered continents. They were rats. To tell the history of medieval war without them is to speak of battles without accounting for the wind. Official chronicles praise human triumphs and failures, celebrating courage and condemning treachery. But rarely do they pause to consider the silent legions lurking in every trench, feasting on the waste of soldiers, gnawing through sacks of grain meant for the winter. In the stillness of night, when human sentries dozed upon their pikes, these creatures roamed freely, fearless and inevitable. They were witnesses to every secret, every famine, every whisper of despair. They did not choose sides, yet served both, or perhaps neither. Their loyalty was to survival alone, yet their impact was nothing short of strategic. At first glance, they were nothing. Vermin. Pests. Creatures to be swatted away or ignored. And yet, their presence foretold transformation. A single rat slipping through a castle corridor could carry more destruction than 1,000 catapults. Not through brute force, but through the slow, creeping rot that follows in its wake. Crumbs stolen from a soldier's ration meant hunger. Droppings in the grain sacks meant illness. A nip in the night meant infection. And layered upon all these quiet injuries was something far more lethal: disease. The rat was not solely a scavenger. It was also a vessel. A courier of death traveling beneath notice, waiting only for the moment when its true power would be revealed. But in the beginning, no one saw the pattern. Medieval chroniclers rarely noted the rodent. Priests delivering sermons on divine punishment never imagined that the wrath of heaven might ride on flea-bitten fur. Knights in polished steel trained tirelessly for battle, but never learned how to defend against whiskers in the dark. To them, warfare was a matter of courage and steel, honor and strategy, fortresses and cavalry. They built walls against arrows but none against infection. They sharpened swords but not their awareness. And so they fought, unaware of the other war already underway. This story is not one of malice, for the rat harbored no intention. It did not seek glory, conquest, or chaos. It merely followed the trail of crumbs that humans left behind. Where people went, rats followed. Where food gathered, they multiplied. Where shelter offered warmth, they burrowed deeper. Medieval towns were paradise for them, narrow alleyways filled with refuse, marketplaces spilling with grain, bakeries radiating heat and scent. Even the grandest castles, resplendent with velvet and stone, could not keep them out. Behind draped banners and beneath royal tables, they thrived. The higher the tower, the deeper the cellar, and there, in the damp, they reigned. No king could banish them. No law could regulate them. No army could meaningfully face them. And yet they remained unmentioned, unconsidered. Their power was not in overt destruction, but in constancy. The rat succeeded through endurance, through ubiquity, through patience. Empires rose and fell in the time it took a rat colony to breed 3 successive generations. Wars lasted years. Rat dynasties lasted centuries. Perhaps it was precisely this familiarity that rendered them invisible. For they were always there. From cradle to grave, a medieval villager would hear the scampering in the night, the scratching behind walls, the soft squeak of tiny feet upon straw. It was a sound so common that no one bothered to listen. And yet, hidden within that whisper was the prelude to catastrophe. Soon, the world would know. Soon, the rat would shed its humble disguise and emerge not as mere nuisance, but as architect of fate. But before the great plague swept across the land, before cartloads of bodies rolled through cobbled streets and before kingdoms trembled not from war but from fever, there was peace. A tense, overlooked peace. one in which man believed he held dominion over the world, blissfully unaware of the forces stirring beneath his very feet. So let us dwell, for a moment longer, in that fragile calm. Picture a medieval tavern at dusk. Laughter rises over wooden tables as ale sloshes in mugs. A minstrel plucks a gentle tune. Boots rest by the fire, weary from travel. In the corner, unseen, a rat watches from beneath a barrel. It waits. It listens. It learns. While men speak of war and heroism, it contemplates only survival. It knows nothing of borders, flags, or alliances. It cares nothing for crowns. Yet in time, it will topple more thrones than any army. And no one at that cheerful table will ever see it coming. History remembers those who make noise. Yet sometimes, the greatest changes come not with a roar, but with a soft rustle in the dark. Before the great dying, before the world learned to fear the sound of scurrying feet, rats lived among humans not as omens of disaster but as quiet companions in the rhythm of daily life. They were not welcomed, yet neither were they truly resisted. They were simply there, as present as the morning frost or the scent of smoke rising from thatched rooftops. Medieval society was not one of sterile order, but of constant closeness, people with people, animals with animals, filth with food, life with decay. In this world, the rat found not only survival, but belonging. Picture a typical medieval village at dawn. The sun rises slowly, casting pale light across mossy walls and crooked fences. Chickens stir in their coops. A dog stretches and yawns by a doorway. A farmer steps outside, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he scatters feed across the ground. Grain spills, and before the hens reach it, smaller shadows flit in from the edges of the yard. Quick, darting, practiced. The farmer sighs, but makes no effort to chase them. He knows there is no use. Rats will always reach the food first. Better to let them have the crumbs than waste energy in a losing battle. Inside the cottage, a mother kneads dough upon a wooden table. Flour drifts into the air like pale mist. The children sleep in a corner beside straw-stuffed mattresses. Beneath the floorboards, a faint rustling stirs. The house dog lifts its head but does not bark. It has heard that sound since birth. Only when a loaf hits the floor will it bother to compete. Until then, all parties are content with the arrangement. It was not only the humble who shared their space with rats. Even in the grand halls of nobility, where tapestries adorned the walls and goblets shimmered under candlelight, the creatures moved freely. Beneath banquet tables, gleaming scraps of mutton and pork fell like gifts from the heavens. Servants swept the floors at the end of feasts, but not without eyes glancing toward the shadows, acknowledging their ever-present audience. Rats were the unseen guests, the final diners at every royal celebration. To the medieval mind, cleanliness was not yet linked to health. Waste lay in the streets, chamber pots were emptied from windows, and butchered remains were tossed into nearby ditches. Cats hunted, dogs scavenged, pigs roamed freely through alleyways. And through it all, the rats thrived, not as invaders, but as part of the environment, another cog in the perpetual cycle of consumption and decay. It was common for people to sleep in close quarters, entire families huddled together for warmth. Blankets were roughly woven and often shared with fleas and lice. It was no surprise that rats also joined them. Many accounts from the era spoke of waking to the feeling of movement at one's feet, or the slight tug of cloth as a rodent passed over it. Some would startle, others would simply roll over, too tired to care. Rats were nuisances, yes, but they were not monsters. They bit only when cornered. They stole only what they needed. And in harsher winters, when hunger tightened its grip, some villagers even came to view them as a backup food supply, an unspoken insurance against famine. Children sometimes kept young rats as pets, taming them with crumbs and curiosity. In urban markets, boys chased them for sport, laughing as they scattered in every direction. In monasteries, monks scribbled complaints about them gnawing through manuscripts, yet these creatures were not met with vengeance, only resignation. They had always been there. They would always be there. Even in ships at harbor, rats claimed dominion. Sailors slept with ropes for pillows and barrels for beds. Beneath the hull, amidst the creaking timbers, rats nested in coils of rope and sacks of grain. They traveled without paying fare, slipping into cargo holds as silent passengers. When merchants unloaded their wares, the rodents disembarked as well, claiming new cities as effortlessly as kings claimed new lands. Where people built, rats followed. Where people feasted, rats multiplied. And yet, for all their presence, few truly observed them. No one wondered what journeys they made each night. No one asked how far they roamed. No one considered what else they might be carrying upon their backs. In the medieval worldview, threats were visible: swords, storms, soldiers. Something that could not be seen was rarely taken seriously. And so, while men prepared for earthly enemies, they ignored the quiet ones nesting beneath their very beds. There was a certain irony in it all. Priests preached of humility before divine mysteries, yet ignored the earthly mysteries beneath their feet. Scholars debated the nature of the soul, yet never contemplated the nature of infestation. Kings ordered new fortifications against invaders, yet never imagined that their downfall might come not from siege towers, but from the smallest of trespasses. Perhaps this was inevitable. Humans see what confirms their expectations. They seek danger in forms they recognize. A warrior anticipates betrayal from rival nations, not from a whiskered shape beneath a barrel. A baker fears the rising cost of flour, not the slow contamination of his storehouse. A mother shields her child from illness, yet never imagines that illness may already sleep in the walls beside them. And so life continued. Sunrises and sunsets passed without alarm. Rats fed. Humans worked. The world turned. There was no warning cry, no omen loud enough to break the trance of normalcy. The bond between human and rat was not one of affection, but of proximity, a silent pact built on crumbs, neglect, and the shared heat of survival. No one yet knew that this mundane coexistence was the calm before the storm. For within those nests and burrows, upon those tiny bodies, a darker force had already taken root. A force with no regard for kings or beggars. A force waiting only for the right moment to awaken. Soon, the world would tremble. But for now, the night remains still. And somewhere beneath the floor, something stirs. Imagine the hush of a medieval battlefield just before dawn. Mist curls over the edges of stone walls, softening the outline of towers and ramparts. From afar, the army waits, banners drooping in the cold, and the clatter of armor echoes faintly across the valley. To the human eye, this is the theater of war: archers, cavalry, and the men-at-arms, each poised to strike. Yet, in the shadows beneath the battlements, behind the stacks of provisions and the heaps of discarded refuse, another army moves silently. It does not carry banners, it does not shout commands, but its impact is no less formidable. The soldiers of this army are small, furred, and whiskered. They are rats, and in the dark calculus of siege warfare, they have already become unintentional instruments of biological chaos. Long before the notion of germ theory emerged, the medieval mind perceived disease as punishment, misfortune, or divine wrath. No one understood that these tiny creatures, hopping from grain to floorboard, from barn to castle, were carrying invisible forces that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. During prolonged sieges, when human ingenuity clashed with the fortifications of stone and mortar, rats became entwined in the struggle. Castles were stockpiled with wheat, barley, and other sustenance meant to outlast months of isolation. Yet rats, opportunistic and relentless, feasted upon the stores. A bag of flour left unattended could harbor hundreds of small intruders by morning. Soldiers, expecting to ration their supplies over weeks, often found themselves facing shortages not from enemy raids but from the silent nocturnal raids of these creatures. Hunger came first, gnawing at morale and resolve. Disease followed, creeping through the camp unnoticed until the first deaths fell upon the unprepared. The psychological toll was just as profound as the physical. Imagine a garrison commander, confident in his defenses, wandering the corridors at night only to hear the soft scratching of tiny claws behind walls, the barely audible squeak of movement over straw and timber. He knows the enemy outside, but another enemy thrives within. Anxiety grows. Soldiers awaken to the faint gnawing at their rations, the twitching of droppings in their bedding, the sensation that unseen eyes are watching their every move. Rest becomes uneasy, morale frays, and discipline wanes. The silent presence of rats amplifies the tension of siege life. What men often failed to recognize was that they were fighting a battle with two fronts, the human and the invisible. In some instances, siege engineers inadvertently assisted this hidden army. Corpses left unburied, grain stores inadequately protected, and refuse piled too close to walls became magnets for rats. Every discarded morsel, every unsealed cask of water, every heap of detritus invited not just scavengers but carriers of disease. In the squalor of medieval encampments, rats multiplied with alarming speed. A single pregnant female could produce dozens of offspring in a matter of months, and with each generation, the population of the unseen army swelled. By the time the first arrows flew over the battlements, a separate war was already raging beneath the feet of soldiers, one waged by creatures too small to be struck by sword or spear, yet powerful enough to weaken and decimate their human foes. Sieges, by their nature, were slow and relentless. A castle could hold out for months, sometimes years, while invaders prowled the surrounding lands. Food dwindled, water became stagnant, and hope ebbed. In this environment, rats became both scavenger and harbinger. They fed not only on stored grains but on the detritus of human suffering, discarded clothing, rotting food, and even the remains of fallen soldiers. Their presence transformed the psychological landscape of the siege. Every night brought a reminder that human mastery over the environment was limited. Every stolen ration, every gnawed sack of wheat, was a subtle erosion of morale. Men grew thin, sickly, and irritable. Orders went unheeded. Plans faltered. Without ever touching the enemy, rats undermined the effectiveness of an entire garrison. Interestingly, in some cases, armies themselves unknowingly depended on rats for survival. During particularly harsh winters or extended sieges, men facing starvation sometimes consumed rats as a last resort. A rat roasted over a fire, though repulsive to many, could sustain a soldier long enough to survive another day. This paradoxical relationship, predator and prey, pest and sustenance, demonstrates the complexity of human-rat interactions. In a world without modern understanding of disease, rats were both a threat and a lifeline, embodying the duality of nature itself. Beyond mere survival, rats played an even darker, more destructive role. Fleas carried by these rodents became unwitting vectors of deadly pathogens. Medieval sieges often created conditions ideal for the proliferation of fleas and bacteria: crowded quarters, unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and decomposing matter. One bite from an infected flea could initiate a chain reaction far beyond comprehension. Soldiers weakened by hunger and exhaustion were especially vulnerable. In many historical accounts, entire units were incapacitated before they even faced the enemy. The combination of hunger, stress, and disease often proved deadlier than any sword or arrow. To the commanders of the day, these losses might have seemed like misfortune or divine punishment, yet in truth, they were consequences of an overlooked but pervasive force, the humble rat. Throughout Europe, chroniclers would later describe the collapse of sieges not in terms of strategy alone, but as inexplicable afflictions striking at both attackers and defenders. Towns that seemed impregnable succumbed not to force but to infection. Armies ready to charge into battle found themselves decimated by fever, vomiting, and plague-like symptoms. While human eyes searched for conspirators or divine omens, the real culprit, the silent, furred army, remained hidden in the shadows. Rats, moving unseen among the wounded, the starving, and the dead, carried both hunger and disease with equal ease. They were, in essence, biological weapons, wielded not by intention but by circumstance. The lesson of these silent soldiers is profound. Medieval warfare was not fought merely with weapons and tactics but with conditions that could amplify or diminish the power of an unseen cohort. Fortresses were erected, walls were thickened, archers trained, yet victory often hinged on the mundane: the cleanliness of the food supply, the proper disposal of waste, and the quiet vigilance, or lack thereof, against creatures too small to be feared. In this interplay between human preparation and natural persistence, rats emerged as unintentional agents of fate. They were neither evil nor heroic. They simply were. And yet their presence shaped history as surely as any battle plan, forcing us to reconsider the invisible threads that weave through the stories of conquest and loss. In the quiet hours, when men slept fitfully upon straw bedding and fires burned low, the rats moved. They gnawed, scavenged, nested, and bred. Each movement was imperceptible, yet each had consequence. In time, the human eye would recognize their impact, but not before entire garrisons had been weakened, entire campaigns delayed, and entire cities rendered vulnerable. Siege warfare, for all its emphasis on skill and courage, had an unacknowledged partner, one that followed the course of human endeavor without pride, without fear, and without fail. In the shadows, rats continued their work, silent and unremarkable to the naked eye, yet devastating in their cumulative effect. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Along the dusty trade routes of Asia, caravans trudged under the weight of goods, animals, and men, unaware that they carried a hidden passenger. Fleas, clinging to fur and feathers, rode unnoticed atop rats that had hitched a ride within the wagons and granaries. These small creatures, so ordinary in appearance, harbored a power beyond imagination, a power that would reshape the course of continents, topple kingdoms, and strike fear into the hearts of all who lived to witness it. Yet in the beginning, there were no alarms, no cries of warning, only the subtle movements of life continuing as it always had. The world was about to face a war it had not chosen, a war no king or general could have commanded, and one in which the greatest armies would find themselves powerless. In the medieval imagination, plague was a puzzle, a divine punishment, a mystery beyond human understanding. Few could have conceived that the tiny rat, already so embedded in daily life, could serve as an unwitting messenger of death. Its mere presence, once inconsequential, would soon become catastrophic. For in the cramped stalls of market towns, the damp cellars of inns, and the bustling ships docked at harbors, rats multiplied freely. They gnawed at grain stores and feasted upon refuse, while the fleas they carried moved from rat to human with ease. Each bite, invisible and often painless, transmitted a bacterium that had the power to unravel life as it was known. The seeds of the Black Death were planted not in malice, but in proximity, the silent convergence of human neglect, animal persistence, and microbial opportunity. Trade, which connected civilizations across vast distances, became the perfect channel for the plague. Merchants, eager to transport silk, spices, and precious metals, never imagined that their cargo included a passenger far deadlier than any armed escort could deter. Rats, hidden in the shadow of sacks and crates, followed the rhythm of commerce with tireless precision. When ships docked in ports from Constantinople to Venice, the creatures disembarked, scurrying into warehouses and homes, unseen but active. A disease that might have remained isolated in a remote village instead spread across continents in a matter of years, carried by the smallest, most unassuming of warriors. The great powers of Europe were powerless against this invisible siege. As the plague took root, its effects were both swift and terrifying. Cities that had bustled with commerce and celebration became ghostly landscapes of fear. Streets emptied as the infected writhed in their homes, fevered and delirious, while rats continued to move unimpeded, their fleas seeking new hosts with relentless efficiency. For those who watched the events unfold, the devastation appeared almost supernatural. Plague did not strike at the battlefield. It invaded homes, monasteries, marketplaces, and taverns. There were no front lines, no strategy, no predictability. The war was silent, indiscriminate, and unavoidable. One moment a village thrived, the next it was a shadow of sorrow, abandoned to silence and decay. Humans, for all their planning and fortification, found themselves helpless in the face of forces they could neither see nor control. The human response was varied and desperate. Some turned to prayer, building shrines and offering penance in hopes of divine intervention. Others blamed foreigners, neighbors, or those considered outcasts. Yet the real enemy remained invisible, persistent, and unacknowledged. Fleas and rats did not adhere to borders, did not heed the king's edicts, and did not care for social status or wealth. Their march was impartial and inevitable. Nobles and peasants alike succumbed to the fever, and in doing so, revealed the fragility of human constructions, both physical and social. The grandeur of fortresses, the pride of armies, the authority of kings, all were powerless before this silent, persistent adversary. As the disease progressed, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. Chroniclers described cities emptied within weeks, families reduced to shadows, and entire trades and crafts abandoned. Merchants who once prided themselves on connections across Europe now feared those same roads. Travelers brought not only news and goods but the seeds of sickness. Yet even as panic spread, the role of rats remained misunderstood. People focused on symptoms, signs, and divine omens. They could not perceive that the true architects of destruction were small, furry, and tireless. The Black Death was not merely a biological event, it was a consequence of human oblivion, a reminder that the smallest beings can wield the most profound influence when circumstances align. Within castles and fortresses, the story was equally harrowing. Soldiers, who had been trained to withstand sieges and repel invaders, found themselves falling ill in barracks and armories. Grain stores, intended to sustain defenders through prolonged conflict, became breeding grounds for rats and disease. Commanders could organize troops and issue orders, yet they could not command immunity. The hierarchy of war, the disciplined formations, the strategic maneuvers, the battle plans, was rendered meaningless in the face of infection. A single bite, a single flea, could decimate units more effectively than any enemy army. It was an invisible battle that no sword, catapult, or fortification could hope to win. This period also illustrates the profound interconnection between human behavior and natural forces. The plague did not strike randomly. Its devastation was amplified by overpopulation, inadequate sanitation, and reliance on long-term grain storage without protection. Ships, markets, and caravans became vectors. Rats thrived in these conditions, and with them, the plague advanced. It is striking to realize that what seemed like a sudden catastrophe was in fact the predictable outcome of centuries of coexistence with rats, coexistence that humans had failed to manage or understand. History, in this sense, was not merely the product of kings, generals, or armies. It was also shaped by the quiet persistence of creatures operating beyond awareness. Despite the terror, there were also moments of eerie calm. Some survivors described wandering through empty streets at dawn, the light catching dust motes in the silence. The only movement was the faint scurrying in the shadows, the soft rustle of rats moving through abandoned homes, searching for sustenance, oblivious to the enormity of the change they facilitated. Nature, in its quiet inevitability, continued its rhythms even as human society faltered. And it is here, in the stillness between death and survival, that the story of the Black Death as a biological war becomes most apparent. The rat, unintentional soldier of history, had succeeded not through cunning, but through persistence, ubiquity, and perfect timing. By the time the plague reached the heart of Europe, it had transformed from a distant menace into a pervasive force that demanded acknowledgement. Populations were reduced by staggering proportions, economies shattered, and social structures strained to breaking. Entire towns disappeared from maps, and the collective memory of survivors was haunted by the invisible enemy. In this war, the usual markers of strategy, fortress walls, swords, shields, banners, were powerless. The rules had changed. Victory was no longer determined by human skill or valor, but by the interaction between humans, rats, fleas, and bacteria. Kings could command armies, but they could not command biology. And so, in this most unwelcome of wars, rats and their tiny companions emerged as the unrecognized generals, orchestrating a campaign that reshaped the world forever. Picture a medieval army preparing to march at dawn. The soldiers tighten their armor, adjust their belts, and check the alignment of banners fluttering faintly in the morning breeze. Horses neigh softly, metal clinks against wood, and drums beat a slow rhythm, signaling order and coordination. To the eye of the general, all is precise and ready. Yet beneath the wagons carrying supplies, behind sacks of grain, and within the folds of tarpaulins, another presence stirs. Rats, silent and tireless, have accompanied these human forces from the very start. They move without permission, without allegiance, but their impact is undeniable. Every step the army takes carries with it an unseen cohort that thrives on the refuse and detritus left behind, following soldiers as loyally as any human companion, yet with consequences far more profound. Long marches were grueling for men and beasts alike. The roads were uneven, muddy, and littered with debris from previous travelers. Food supplies were rationed meticulously, often stretched thin to sustain the force over weeks or months. Yet, the very materials intended to sustain life became a magnet for rat activity. Grain sacks, barrels of flour, and containers of salted meat were gnawed through while the soldiers slept. Sometimes the damage was minimal, a handful of grains lost. Other times, entire stores were rendered useless, forcing commanders to ration more tightly, pushing men closer to exhaustion and hunger. The rats did not choose sides, they cared only for survival, but in doing so, they influenced the fortunes of armies, often determining the course of campaigns before a single sword was drawn. In camp, the effects were even more pronounced. Soldiers built temporary shelters, their tents pitched closely together, straw bedding scattered on the ground. Cooking fires filled the air with the rich scent of roasted meat and baking bread. These same scents were irresistible to the hidden army of rats. At night, while soldiers rested, rats moved through the camp with perfect stealth. They gnawed, scurried, and occasionally bit, leaving traces of disease in their wake. Fleas and other parasites transferred easily from rodent to human, taking advantage of the cramped sleeping conditions. Within days, what began as small inconveniences, the loss of food, minor bites, could escalate into illness, weakening even the strongest and most disciplined soldiers. Armies, trained for battle, were often undone not by enemy strategy but by the quiet persistence of these creatures. The relationship between humans and rats on the march was paradoxical. In some instances, soldiers learned to hunt them for sustenance. A roasted rat could provide a small but essential source of protein when other food ran out. For men on the brink of starvation, this was a lifeline. And yet, the same creatures that saved lives also carried the seeds of destruction. Fleas-bearing pathogens hopped to the next human host, subtly spreading disease throughout the ranks. In this way, rats embodied a duality, both savior and silent executioner, nourishing and undermining simultaneously. It was a cruel irony, yet one that no man could have foreseen, and one that demonstrated the profound ways in which nature interwove with human endeavor. Rats also influenced logistics in ways that commanders could not anticipate. Siege engineers and quartermasters often spent days rationing supplies, calculating the precise amount of food and water necessary for the campaign ahead. Yet their efforts could be rendered moot by the persistent gnawing of rodents. When entire sacks of grain were spoiled, when water barrels were contaminated, or when disease took hold among soldiers, plans unraveled. Battles were fought with fewer men, less energy, and diminished morale. What might have been a decisive engagement could become a drawn-out struggle simply because the hidden participants of the campaign had done their work quietly in the background. Travel along rivers and across oceans carried the same silent companions. Ships transporting soldiers and supplies became moving microcosms of infestation. Rats nested in cargo holds, scuttled through rigging, and gnawed at ropes and sails. Fleas followed them, hopping from rat to human. Sailors, confined in cramped quarters for weeks at a time, were especially vulnerable. Many fell ill long before reaching foreign shores, weakening the army's effectiveness even before battle commenced. Entire fleets sometimes arrived with crews so reduced by illness that landing and establishing camp became an arduous challenge. In these instances, the army's fate was inseparable from the quiet influence of rats, demonstrating that no amount of training or discipline could counterbalance the power of nature when left unchecked. The presence of rats on the march also altered human behavior in subtle ways. Soldiers became more cautious with food, covering it hastily, keeping watch over grain and flour. They took measures to protect supplies, constructing elevated platforms or storing items in closed containers. Yet even these strategies were often insufficient. Rats were persistent and adaptable, slipping through cracks, burrowing beneath floors, and navigating through the smallest gaps. Their persistence taught an unintended lesson, that preparation and vigilance were vital not only against visible enemies but also against invisible forces that could shape outcomes just as decisively. Perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The constant presence of rats created an undercurrent of unease. Soldiers were aware that something unseen prowled around them, stealing their food, disturbing their rest, and sometimes carrying disease. Sleep became fitful. Morale wavered. Decisions that seemed straightforward were complicated by the looming awareness of vulnerability in their own quarters. Commanders, already stressed by the weight of responsibility, were forced to contend with the unpredictable and uncontrollable influence of rats, a factor entirely beyond their training or experience. It was an invisible opponent that could neither be reasoned with nor fought conventionally, yet its power was undeniable. Even in moments of triumph, rats followed silently. After a victorious engagement, as soldiers celebrated and tended to the wounded, these creatures scavenged the aftermath. They consumed scraps, gnawed on supplies, and carried fleas from one survivor to another. In this way, the cycle of influence continued, demonstrating that rats were not temporary intruders but consistent participants in the theater of war. Their presence blurred the lines between battlefield and camp, combat and survival, showing that the fate of men was never entirely in their own hands. As the army moved from village to village, fortress to fortress, the rat population adapted, multiplied, and spread. They followed every path, every wagon, every footstep, shaping human experience at every turn. They were unremarkable in appearance, unassuming in behavior, yet their effect on history was profound. Where men saw only routine marches, logistics, and strategy, there existed a parallel campaign, conducted quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly. This hidden war was waged on multiple fronts simultaneously: supply, health, morale, always tipping the scales in subtle but decisive ways. By the time a siege or battle approached, the human soldiers often faced not only the opposing army but the accumulated impact of the silent legions that had traveled with them. Hunger, fatigue, disease, and stress, amplified by rats and their fleas, weakened their resolve and performance. A general might plan meticulously, yet the success of his campaign could hinge on factors he did not understand, factors he could not see. In this, the march of armies revealed a hidden truth, that the smallest participants could exert the greatest influence, and that human history, in many ways, had always been intertwined with the quiet persistence of the natural world. The castle gates closed with a resounding clang, marking the beginning of yet another siege. Beyond the thick stone walls, soldiers prepared for weeks or months of uncertainty. Inside, the inhabitants braced themselves for isolation, rationing every morsel of bread and every drop of water with careful calculation. Yet even as the human defenders focused on stockpiling and strategy, another presence quietly asserted itself. Rats, ever opportunistic, claimed their place in this constrained world, moving freely through storerooms, granaries, and hidden crevices. In the strange alchemy of medieval siege life, these creatures became part of an unspoken economy, a currency of survival, threat, and adaptation. During prolonged sieges, food scarcity was the most pressing concern. Grain meant survival. A loaf of bread could sustain a family for days, a sack of flour might feed a battalion for a week. But these provisions were never entirely secure. Rats gnawed relentlessly at sacks of wheat and barley, leaving holes and contaminating the contents with droppings and urine. Each lost sack was a setback, forcing rationing, improvisation, and sometimes desperation. Soldiers and villagers alike learned to count the cost of the invisible invaders. Every grain loss translated into hunger, exhaustion, and vulnerability. What seemed a minor inconvenience to the outside observer was, in reality, a critical factor in the calculus of survival. The siege, after all, was not fought solely against human enemies. It was fought against time, scarcity, and the relentless persistence of nature. In some cases, rats became a form of currency in themselves. Desperate defenders, aware that grain stores would not last, sometimes resorted to trading rats as emergency rations. Small, roasted, or boiled, these creatures provided protein in a world otherwise dominated by bread, salted meat, and cheese. Soldiers who had once scorned the thought now accepted it as necessary. What was pest became sustenance, what was nuisance became resource. In this sense, the rat economy was both practical and grimly symbolic. The creature that threatened life could simultaneously prolong it. Such paradoxes were common in the harsh realities of medieval warfare, where survival often depended on adaptability and ingenuity. The rat economy extended beyond direct consumption. Their presence influenced strategy, storage, and logistics. Commanders learned to protect provisions by elevating sacks, covering barrels, or situating granaries in less accessible areas. Some even attempted to manipulate the rat population, encouraging them into certain zones to protect more critical supplies. This subtle interplay demonstrates a form of tactical awareness rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. While humans waged battles with weapons and armor, the unseen war against rodents required creativity, observation, and patience. The economy of siege survival was therefore as much about understanding the movements of rats as it was about understanding the movements of armies. Yet, even with careful planning, rats were unpredictable. A single breach in a wall, a dropped sack, or a neglected corner could undo days of preparation. Their mobility and adaptability meant that they could exploit the smallest oversight, undermining human authority with quiet efficiency. Chroniclers of the time often described mysterious shortages or sudden outbreaks of illness within besieged fortresses, attributing them to divine punishment or misfortune. In reality, these events were frequently the result of a rat economy operating just beyond human perception. It was a world in which ordinary creatures exerted extraordinary influence, shaping outcomes in ways that could determine the fate of entire communities. The psychological dimension of this economy was profound. Soldiers and villagers alike lived under constant awareness of the rat threat. Sleep was uneasy, meals were scrutinized, and even leisure time carried the faint tension of vigilance. The creatures, ever present, acted as a reminder that humans were never fully in control. They could plan, ration, and fortify, yet the smallest of intruders could compromise even the most meticulous arrangements. In this way, rats shaped not only the material aspects of siege life but also its emotional and mental landscape. Fear, anxiety, and exhaustion became tools of influence wielded by creatures too small to be seen as legitimate adversaries, yet undeniably effective in their quiet campaigns. Accounts from the period reveal how deeply the rat economy permeated daily existence. In one siege, defenders reportedly measured grain losses nightly, noting the spread of damage and attempting to predict the movements of the hidden scavengers. In another, soldiers used their dogs to chase rats from critical supplies, though success was limited. Chroniclers occasionally mentioned rats in passing, yet rarely grasped the full scope of their impact. They were considered nuisances rather than strategic participants, though in truth they played a central role in determining the health, morale, and endurance of the besieged. In a way, the rat economy operated as an unacknowledged partner in warfare, shaping decisions and outcomes from the shadows. Beyond food, rats also affected hygiene and disease within the besieged walls. Their droppings contaminated water supplies and living quarters, contributing to outbreaks of dysentery, fever, and other illnesses. Fleas that infested rats became vectors of more dangerous pathogens, including the bacteria that would later fuel the Black Death. In this sense, the economy was both literal and metaphorical. Rats consumed food, but they also consumed resilience, morale, and health. Each infestation weakened human fortitude, tilting the balance between endurance and collapse. What began as a simple struggle for sustenance transformed into a complex web of influence, demonstrating the invisible yet decisive role these creatures played in medieval life. Remarkably, some survivors developed strategies to coexist with or exploit the rat economy. Grain was stored in barrels with tight lids, refuse was buried or burned, fires were maintained to discourage intrusion. In desperate moments, rats themselves became the final resource, hunted and consumed to delay starvation. These adaptations illustrate a sophisticated understanding of the interdependent relationship between humans and nature, even in the absence of modern scientific knowledge. The lessons of the rat economy were learned slowly, often at great cost, and yet they reveal the ingenuity and resilience of medieval societies under siege. Ultimately, the rat economy was not merely a curiosity or nuisance, it was a force shaping the very structure of siege warfare. Every gnawed sack, every stolen morsel, every flea-infested bite contributed to the broader outcome. Soldiers and civilians alike were compelled to recognize that survival depended as much on managing the movements of small creatures as on outmaneuvering human adversaries. In this quiet, uncelebrated theater of war, rats exercised influence in proportion to their persistence and adaptability. They were both a challenge and a resource, an unseen army whose currency was survival itself. And in this intricate, invisible economy, the fortunes of human empires rose and fell, often without anyone realizing that the smallest participants had wielded the greatest power. Even as armies moved and castles withstood sieges, another force traveled with them, almost invisible yet infinitely more lethal, the flea. Tiny, wingless, and merciless, These creatures were the unseen couriers of catastrophe. They clung to the fur of rats, unnoticed by human eyes, slipping onto sleeping soldiers, infected animals, and unsuspecting villagers. In the cramped quarters of camps, ships, and fortresses, their movements were swift and invisible. Fleas did not wage war in the conventional sense. They did not need banners, swords, or orders. They carried death in their tiny bodies, riding silently across borders, cities, and nations. The rat was their host, but the flea was their agent, delivering a silent epidemic that no human army could anticipate or defend against. Fleas thrived in conditions the medieval world often provided without realizing it. Crowded living spaces, unwashed bodies, piles of straw, damp floors, and neglected waste offered the perfect breeding grounds. Each rat in a camp or town could host dozens of fleas, each capable of leaping from one host to another in search of a meal. When a soldier lay exhausted after a day of marching or fighting, the fleas found him, biting and feeding with a persistence that was almost imperceptible at first. Each bite might transmit bacteria, gradually weakening the body from within. Soldiers became ill, sometimes before they even noticed any symptoms, and as sickness spread, it moved silently, invisibly, like a creeping fog that claimed entire battalions before battle ever commenced. It is striking to imagine the psychology of these times. Humans understood that illness existed, yet its origin remained a mystery. Fever, swelling, blackened skin, and delirium appeared inexplicably, prompting fear, superstition, and desperate remedies. Priests performed blessings, apothecaries administered herbal concoctions, and charlatans claimed miraculous cures. None understood that the root of the devastation lay in the microscopic hitchhikers carried by the rats accompanying every caravan, every army, every market journey. What was invisible to the human eye dictated the fate of cities and armies alike, revealing a hidden hierarchy of power in which the smallest creatures wielded authority over life and death. The relationship between rats and fleas was perfectly synchronized. Rats provided movement, warmth, and shelter. Fleas provided transmission. One without the other was far less effective. Together, they formed a perfect system of disease propagation. The medieval world, blissfully unaware, became a vast network of potential hosts. Trade routes, pilgrimages, and military campaigns connected regions in ways that facilitated the silent march of plague. Each human interaction, each bustling marketplace, became an opportunity for these microscopic forces to spread. What humans perceived as random outbreaks of misfortune was, in fact, a predictable consequence of an ecological network they could not observe or control. Imagine a town preparing for a festival or a market day. The streets are crowded, vendors shout their wares, and children run through the alleys, laughter echoing against stone walls. Beneath their feet and hidden in crates, barrels, and granaries, rats move with tireless precision. Fleas jump from rodent to human, finding new hosts to feed upon, carrying pathogens that will multiply unseen for days. By the time the first symptoms appear, swollen lymph nodes, fever, chills, the disease has already infiltrated the social fabric of the town. Panic sets in, but it is too late to prevent the spread. Fleas, silent and invisible, have already completed their mission. What follows is an eerie combination of fear, helplessness, and grief, leaving communities forever changed. Ships were no less vulnerable. Fleas and rats traveled across oceans, hidden within cargo and provisions. Sailors, confined in close quarters, became prime hosts. Fleas fed during the night, moving from rats to humans with seamless efficiency. Infections began quietly, often unnoticed until several crew members fell ill. By the time ports were reached and travelers disembarked, disease had already crossed boundaries and was ready to infiltrate new towns and cities. Fleas, with their uncanny ability to sense and locate a host, ensured that the march of disease continued wherever human activity spread. They were the perfect agents of an unseen, unstoppable force. The lethality of the fleas was amplified by human ignorance. Medieval medicine lacked knowledge of germ theory, sanitation was limited, and quarantine measures were primitive or inconsistent. Inhabitants of besieged towns often doubled their efforts to protect against external threats, fortifications, weapons, and patrols, while remaining oblivious to the enemy crawling silently beside them. Fleas exploited this oversight, spreading disease in ways that no human intervention could counter effectively. From noble courts to humble cottages, the pattern was the same: vulnerability magnified by ignorance, mortality amplified by the persistent efficiency of a hidden ecosystem. Over time, the effects were unmistakable. Villages emptied, markets quieted, and cities became ghostly landscapes of abandoned homes and silent streets. Entire families vanished within weeks, leaving behind only the faint echo of life and the relentless movement of rats and fleas. Survivors carried the psychological scars of the experience: fear of movement, suspicion of strangers, and an acute awareness of the invisible forces that could destroy life in an instant. The flea, so small and unremarkable, had achieved something no army or siege could: the reshaping of human society itself. Even in the midst of catastrophe, human adaptation emerged. Those who survived learned to clean floors, dispose of waste more carefully, and isolate the sick when possible. Some communities moved away from infested areas, others burned infected buildings to halt further spread. Yet these measures were often reactive, insufficient, and implemented after devastating losses. The silent partnership of rats and fleas proved resilient, adaptable, and difficult to eradicate. In every corner, in every market, camp, and village, they continued their relentless work, shaping history quietly, invisibly, and with extraordinary impact. In retrospect, it becomes clear that fleas were not simply pests, they were agents of transformation. They changed demographics, disrupted economies, altered military campaigns, and influenced social behavior. Entire populations were shifted, and in the aftermath, human understanding of disease began to evolve, though still rudimentary by modern standards. The silent march of disease revealed a truth that remains relevant today: that the smallest, most overlooked participants in an ecosystem can wield influence far beyond their size, reshaping events in ways humans may not fully comprehend. Rats provided movement, fleas provided transmission, and together, they orchestrated a force that no human power could match. The story of fleas, rats, and disease is one of inevitability and precision. No planning, no strategy, no human might could fully counteract the efficiency of their combined march. The silent battlefield was everywhere: within homes, in camps, along trade routes, and across continents. Those who fell victim did so not through neglect alone, but because they were caught in the wake of an ecological system operating on rules humans did not yet understand. In this intersection of biology, human behavior, and historical circumstance, we see the extraordinary consequences of unseen forces, and the enduring lesson that sometimes the smallest beings leave the largest mark on history. In the quiet hours of medieval nights, the presence of rats often went unnoticed by humans, but their impact on society was profound. The creatures were not merely pests, they were unintentional agents of disruption, capable of reshaping the very structure of human life. Where humans saw mundane challenges, grain theft, bitten shoes, soiled floors, rats exerted influence far beyond the domestic sphere. Their persistent scavenging undermined food supplies, their fleas carried deadly disease, and their omnipresence created an atmosphere of anxiety that rippled through entire communities. To truly understand the power of these small, furry invaders, one must look not just at the physical destruction they caused, but at the cascading social consequences of their actions. Medieval society was fragile in ways that modern observers might struggle to comprehend. Populations were dense in towns, sanitation was minimal, and food storage techniques were rudimentary. Crops were heavily dependent on seasonal success, and the failure of even a single harvest could produce famine. In this delicate ecosystem, rats thrived, exploiting human vulnerability. They gnawed through stored grain, contaminated supplies, and multiplied unchecked. A family's survival could hinge on the integrity of a single storage sack. Entire towns could teeter on the brink of crisis if these small creatures invaded in sufficient numbers. Rats, unknowingly, became catalysts for social instability, shaping the rhythm of medieval life from the shadows. As disease spread, so too did fear. Fleas carried by rats transmitted pathogens that decimated populations in ways both swift and indiscriminate. Communities that had once relied on tight social networks found those networks strained to breaking. Households were isolated, labor forces diminished, and trade disrupted. Markets, hubs of economic and social exchange, fell silent as sellers and buyers alike fled the invisible threat. Clergy performed rites, pleading for divine intervention, while citizens barricaded themselves behind doors, leaving streets and town squares eerily empty. Social cohesion, which had been the backbone of communal survival, frayed under the relentless pressure of hunger, sickness, and anxiety. Rats, in partnership with fleas and disease, became unlikely architects of this collapse. Consider the impact on governance. Local lords and magistrates faced unprecedented challenges. They were responsible for maintaining order, securing food supplies, and organizing defense, yet they were powerless against the invisible agents eroding the foundation of their authority. Laws became difficult to enforce as fear and desperation grew. Communities that once functioned smoothly found themselves descending into chaos. Riots, theft, and civil unrest were often indirect consequences of rat-fueled scarcity and disease. Ordinary citizens, struggling to survive, began to act in ways that challenged hierarchical structures. In this sense, rats were agents not merely of physical destruction, but of social transformation, revealing vulnerabilities in human institutions that had been taken for granted. The psychological toll was equally significant. Human beings are acutely aware of threats in their environment, even when those threats are small. The scurrying of rats in walls or along floorboards at night created a constant background anxiety. Families, already stressed by the uncertainty of food and the fear of disease, found their sleep disturbed, their concentration broken, and their patience thinned. Children were taught from an early age to watch for rats, to avoid their hiding places, to guard what little food remained. Anxiety became woven into the fabric of daily life, shaping behavior, altering routines, and reinforcing the perception that humans were never truly in control. The simple presence of rats could influence decision-making at every level, from household management to strategic planning. Markets and trade, the lifeblood of medieval economies, were particularly vulnerable. Grain, flour, and other staples were prime targets for infestation. Merchants who had once enjoyed predictable profits suddenly faced losses that could be catastrophic. The economic ripple effects spread through communities. Families could no longer buy necessary goods, artisans could not sell their crafts, and the circulation of money slowed. Rats, in essence, acted as an invisible economic force, redirecting resources, amplifying scarcity, and destabilizing local economies. This influence extended beyond towns to the broader social structure, shaping patterns of migration, labor distribution, and social hierarchy. Rats also played a role in amplifying the effects of famine. In years when crops failed, rat populations would often surge, feeding on whatever remained. Their voracious consumption accelerated the depletion of food stocks, pushing already vulnerable populations to the brink. Communities found themselves forced to make impossible choices, consume contaminated food, resort to desperate hunting, or risk starvation. These circumstances created social tension, weakened alliances, and heightened competition for resources. Rats, though unintentional participants, became key players in the chain of events leading to widespread social disruption. Their actions demonstrated that even the smallest organisms could wield disproportionate influence over human societies. Religious institutions, which had once provided stability and guidance, were not immune. Monasteries, churches, and charitable organizations were heavily dependent on local populations for support. As disease and famine spread, congregations shrank, donations diminished, and the ability of the church to maintain its social role weakened. Monks and clergy, while attending to the sick and dying, were themselves vulnerable to infection. Rats and fleas, silent yet deadly, undermined the spiritual and social cohesion of communities. In this context, their influence extended beyond material scarcity, shaping the very moral and emotional landscape of medieval life. Even political power was affected. Lords and kings who relied on taxation, tribute, and manpower found their authority eroded as populations declined and unrest increased. A stable social order depended on predictable human behavior, yet the introduction of persistent pestilence and scarcity disrupted those patterns. Entire regions faced depopulation, reducing the workforce, weakening military capabilities, and destabilizing the existing hierarchy. In this sense, rats, through their role in transmitting disease and depleting resources, indirectly shaped the political context of Europe. The seemingly innocuous creatures operating in the shadows had become unacknowledged architects of societal transformation. Yet, for all their influence, rats were not conscious agents of destruction. They acted according to instinct and necessity, unaware of the cascading consequences of their presence. Their impact illustrates a profound truth about history: not all forces shaping human destiny are intentional or recognized. The smallest creatures, moving according to their own imperatives, can wield power that far exceeds their size. In the interplay between humans and rats, between order and chaos, we see how society can be reshaped not only by human intention but also by the relentless, adaptive rhythms of nature. By the end of a typical plague-affected year, entire communities had been altered irrevocably. The social fabric, once robust, bore the marks of stress, scarcity, and loss. Families had disappeared, markets had shuttered, and authority structures had been strained. Rats, through their direct and indirect actions, were central to this transformation. They were not merely creatures of nuisance, they were unwitting agents of social collapse, demonstrating that the path of human history is often guided by forces far smaller, quieter, and more persistent than armies or kings. The lesson is timeless. Survival depends not only on human ingenuity but on understanding the delicate interplay between society, environment, and the creatures that inhabit it. Medieval chroniclers often painted vivid pictures of the horrors of war, yet within these accounts lies an often overlooked detail: the pervasive presence of rats during sieges. Soldiers' diaries, city records, and monastic chronicles tell stories of castles under siege, towns starving under blockade, and armies crippled not only by human opponents but by the relentless gnawing and nocturnal movements of these creatures. Rats appeared in accounts almost as a secondary menace, yet their impact was both profound and inescapable. They were companions to the suffering, observers of despair, and agents of both subtle and catastrophic change, moving invisibly through the shadows as men struggled to survive. Consider the chronicles of the siege of Kaffa in the mid-14th century. The city, under relentless attack, faced famine, exhaustion, and fear. Grain stores, meant to sustain the defenders, were relentlessly attacked by rats. Chroniclers describe soldiers discovering empty sacks and chewed barrels, realizing that nature itself had joined the enemy's side. Fleas carried by the rats exacerbated the situation, transmitting disease to those already weakened by hunger. Accounts mention fever, swelling, and rapidly spreading mortality. Historians later connected these events to the early spread of the Black Death into Europe, but at the time, the inhabitants saw only the tangible suffering of hunger, illness, and the gnawing presence of rats. The small creatures moved unnoticed through the fabric of daily siege life, influencing outcomes in ways the chroniclers could not fully comprehend. Diaries of soldiers paint similarly stark images. One soldier recounted nights spent on straw bedding, hearing the faint scratching of rats along floorboards. The sound, seemingly innocuous, became a source of anxiety, a reminder that human control was incomplete. Every morsel of food required constant vigilance, every corner of the camp was suspect, and every movement in the shadows was a potential threat. Rats gnawed on supplies with tireless persistence, moving from granaries to kitchens and hiding in the nooks of tents. Even the most disciplined soldiers were forced to adapt to this ever-present nuisance, creating makeshift barriers and traps, often with limited success. The chronicles reveal a war fought not only against human adversaries but against persistent, invisible agents operating in the background of every siege. Monastic records offer yet another perspective. Monks, documenting life around fortified towns, frequently noted the effect of rats on both supplies and the general well-being of populations. Flour and grain intended for communal feeding programs were often spoiled. Stored foods became breeding grounds for rodents, which in turn spread fleas and disease. Chroniclers described entire barns and cellars rendered unusable, forcing monks and townsfolk to ration even more severely. In some instances, monks were forced to consume the rats themselves, roasting them over fires to stave off starvation. These records, written with meticulous attention to detail, convey both the practical challenges posed by rats and the psychological weight of their omnipresence. In some military accounts, the presence of rats had strategic implications. Commanders observed that troops weakened by starvation or disease were less capable in battle. Entire units could be incapacitated by illness spread indirectly through rat infestations in camp. Chroniclers occasionally noted the mysterious decline of garrisons and speculated on the causes: bad luck, divine displeasure, or poorly rationed supplies. Rarely did they recognize the true role of rats and their fleas. Yet the pattern is clear: wherever rat populations were allowed to thrive in proximity to humans, the human capacity for endurance and effective combat diminished. This invisible factor became a determining element in the success or failure of many sieges. There are also stories of ingenuity and adaptation. Some chroniclers recount soldiers creating barriers to protect grain, such as suspending sacks from beams, placing them on raised platforms, or surrounding them with traps. Others describe using cats or trained dogs to hunt and control rats within camp and fortress walls. Even when these measures were partially effective, the pervasive presence of rats ensured that vigilance remained constant. Chroniclers often remarked on the psychological fatigue that resulted, noting that soldiers' alertness waned under the relentless demands of defending not only against the enemy but against a ceaselessly active and unpredictable natural opponent. Accounts from towns under prolonged siege reveal the communal impact of rat infestations. Families confined indoors with dwindling resources found themselves forced to cope with both hunger and infestation. Chroniclers describe children frightened by nocturnal scurrying, parents exhausted by the constant need to guard food, and households turning to desperate measures such as hunting rats for sustenance. Fleas added a further invisible layer of terror, spreading disease in cramped conditions. Through these narratives, it becomes evident that rats were more than a nuisance; they were an integral, albeit unacknowledged, part of the siege ecosystem, shaping human experience from multiple angles simultaneously. Even in post-battle accounts, chroniclers noted the lingering effects of rats. Cities recovering from sieges often faced new challenges as rat populations swelled in the aftermath, attracted to food stores and debris left behind. Abandoned buildings and damaged infrastructure created perfect habitats, perpetuating cycles of infestation and disease. Survivors found themselves grappling not only with the direct consequences of human conflict but with the persistent influence of rats, whose presence subtly altered the reconstruction of communities. In this way, rats influenced history not only during active conflict but also in the periods of recovery, ensuring their role as constant, if silent, participants in human affairs. The storytelling style of these chronicles often imbued rats with almost mythical significance. Soldiers and townsfolk, unaware of the biological mechanics at play, described the creatures with a mix of fear, fascination, and resignation. They were described as invaders, pests, and omens of misfortune. While chroniclers lacked scientific understanding, the narrative power of their accounts reveals a keen awareness of rats as agents of disruption. In the margins of battle reports and monastery records, the quiet presence of rats emerges as a recurring theme, shaping the lived experience of those who survived the sieges and shaping the collective memory that passed down through generations. In reflecting on these chronicles, one sees the layered impact of rats: tangible damage to food supplies, indirect spread of disease through fleas, and psychological pressure on humans. Their presence forced adaptation, ingenuity, and resilience, even in the harshest circumstances. At the same time, they were a constant reminder of human vulnerability, demonstrating that survival depended on attention to both seen and unseen forces. Chroniclers, by documenting these experiences, provide a rare glimpse into the hidden dynamics of medieval warfare, highlighting the unintentional yet profound role rats played in shaping outcomes and experiences during sieges. Ultimately, these tales from the trenches remind us that history is rarely a story of human action alone. The accounts reveal the interconnectedness of humans, animals, and disease, illustrating how seemingly minor participants, rats and fleas, could influence the trajectory of entire campaigns, communities, and societies. The chronicles offer more than just historical facts; they offer insight into the lived reality of medieval life under siege, where survival was dictated not only by strategy and strength but also by the quiet, persistent forces moving silently in the shadows. In medieval Europe, trade was the lifeblood of towns and cities. Merchants traveled long distances, caravans carried precious goods, and marketplaces bustled with life and noise. Yet behind this vibrant economic tapestry lurked a subtle, persistent threat: the rat. These small, unassuming creatures had the power to reshape not only the immediate fortunes of households but also the broader flow of commerce. Their gnawing and scavenging, often unnoticed at first, created a chain reaction that affected storage, trade, and social order. The economic ripple caused by rats was profound, extending far beyond a single warehouse or granary, and leaving an indelible mark on medieval markets. Grain, the foundation of both diet and commerce, was particularly vulnerable. Merchants relied on stable supplies to meet the demands of towns and cities, yet rats, drawn to the stored food, gnawed holes in sacks, scattered contents across floors, and contaminated remaining provisions. Each chewed grain was more than just a minor loss. It represented a weakening of supply chains, the loss of income, and the potential for scarcity-induced inflation. For small merchants, these losses could be catastrophic. For entire towns, rat-infested warehouses threatened the stability of food prices, access to essential goods, and the general sense of security necessary for thriving markets. The problem was exacerbated by the design of medieval storage. Granaries and warehouses were often poorly sealed, built for accessibility rather than protection. Rats slipped through cracks in walls, gaps in doors, and openings in roofs. Once inside, they multiplied rapidly, feeding on provisions and leaving behind droppings that could spoil additional food. Traders, unaware of the full scale of infestation, often discovered the damage only after it was too late to recover lost supplies. Markets, once predictable, became volatile, forcing both buyers and sellers to adjust expectations and plan around the invisible presence of rats. In effect, the creatures acted as an unrecognized economic regulator, redistributing resources, influencing behavior, and reshaping trade patterns. Rats' impact extended beyond mere loss of grain. Fleas, which often traveled alongside these rodents, carried disease that could incapacitate entire merchant caravans. A single outbreak could decimate trading parties, interrupting supply lines, and leaving towns without essential goods. Merchants faced delays, increased costs, and a reduction in available labor. Even when plague or illness was not directly linked to rats, the fear of infestation and disease caused significant economic disruption. Buyers might avoid markets, transport routes could be altered, and surplus stock could go unsold. In this way, rats indirectly influenced the broader economic landscape, affecting decisions, planning, and human behavior on a large scale. Cities that depended on trade as a primary source of wealth experienced particularly acute effects. Merchants losing goods to rats were forced to raise prices to compensate, which in turn affected affordability for the populace. Families found themselves buying smaller portions of grain or substituting less desirable foods. Trade negotiations became more cautious, contracts more conservative, and risk management increasingly central to business operations. Town leaders recognized the importance of maintaining both food security and market stability, yet the persistent movement of rats made control extremely difficult. Even with increased vigilance, the creatures exploited small oversights, leaving merchants and citizens alike vulnerable to sudden shortages or unexpected financial strain. The ripple effect reached rural producers as well. Farmers transporting grain to urban centers faced losses in storage or during transport, as rats consumed portions of their hard-earned harvests. This reduced their income, limiting the ability to reinvest in seeds, equipment, or labor. In some regions, repeated infestations forced communities to change agricultural practices, relocate storage facilities, or alter trade routes to minimize exposure. The interaction between humans and rats became a driving force in shaping economic decision-making, illustrating that even small creatures could influence not only immediate financial outcomes but also long-term planning and regional economic strategies. Market towns also experienced changes in social behavior due to rat infestations. Buyers became more selective, wary of contaminated goods, and sometimes demanded proof of storage integrity before making purchases. Merchants responded with new strategies, elevating grain, sealing containers, or moving stock to less accessible locations. Communities developed rituals and practices to reduce risk, from regular inspections to controlled feeding of domestic animals to distract rodents. These adaptations were early forms of risk management, demonstrating human ingenuity in response to persistent, unseen threats. Rats, inadvertently, became teachers of resourcefulness, resilience, and adaptability, shaping economic and social norms in ways historians are only beginning to fully appreciate. The psychological impact of rats on trade was profound. The constant threat of loss and contamination created an atmosphere of tension and vigilance. Merchants, laborers, and consumers lived with the awareness that resources were never entirely secure. This omnipresent anxiety shaped decision-making. Merchants might sell goods quickly to minimize risk, consumers might hoard supplies in fear of scarcity, and towns might invest in rat mitigation measures at significant expense. The presence of these small creatures affected behavior, not only through tangible loss but through the psychological pressure of constant vigilance, demonstrating the multilayered influence of rats on medieval economic life. Interestingly, rats sometimes influenced innovation and the development of early pest management techniques. Barrels were sealed with tighter lids, granaries were raised above ground level, and cats or other predators were introduced into storage areas. In some cases, entire sections of warehouses were redesigned to minimize accessibility. While these measures were not foolproof, they reflect an evolving understanding of the relationship between humans and their environment. Rats, by forcing adaptation, played an indirect role in technological and procedural innovation, demonstrating that adversity, even caused by the smallest creatures, can drive creativity and progress. Beyond markets and warehouses, rats shaped the broader flow of commerce by influencing transportation and trade routes. Merchants and caravan leaders, aware of the risk of infestation, sometimes altered routes, delayed shipments, or avoided certain towns altogether. Ports and riverside warehouses took on increased importance, as traders sought more secure storage or faster transfer to avoid prolonged exposure. In this way, rats indirectly guided the movement of goods across regions, contributing to patterns of economic connectivity, risk assessment, and strategic planning that went far beyond the immediate damage they caused. These small creatures, operating without intent or malice, became inadvertent regulators of medieval trade. The cumulative effect of rat activity on medieval economies was staggering. Individual merchants faced losses that could mean ruin, towns experienced shortages that triggered social tension, and regional trade networks were destabilized by repeated infestations. Yet the lessons were profound. Resilience, vigilance, and adaptation were essential to survival, and small creatures could shape the course of commerce in ways that humans were only beginning to understand. Rats, seemingly insignificant, were in fact powerful actors, influencing economic behavior, social structures, and the historical trajectory of entire regions. Their quiet, persistent presence transformed medieval trade into a landscape shaped as much by biology as by human ambition. As medieval generals plotted battles on parchment maps, placing armies with precision and considering every possible outcome, they often overlooked an unseen strategist, the rat. These small, unassuming creatures moved freely through camps, granaries, and fortresses, affecting the outcomes of campaigns in ways that human commanders could not predict. While knights trained, archers practiced, and infantry drilled, rats gnawed through supplies, carried fleas, and influenced the physical and psychological readiness of soldiers. In this sense, rats became hidden architects of medieval strategy, quietly shaping the balance of power, tipping the scales of war, and redefining what it meant to plan for success on the battlefield. Consider the logistics of a typical campaign. Armies depended on precise calculations of food, water, and equipment to sustain men and horses over long distances. Grain stores were carefully rationed, barrels of salted meat allocated, and horses fed according to meticulously planned schedules. Yet, even with the greatest diligence, rats could compromise these calculations. Sacks of grain were gnawed open, stored provisions contaminated, and water supplies infiltrated. Commanders, unaware of the full scope of infestation, might find their troops weakened not by the enemy's attack but by hunger, illness, and fatigue amplified by these persistent intruders. The smallest of creatures were effectively shaping the outcomes of decisions made by human strategists. The psychological dimension of rat influence on strategy cannot be overstated. Soldiers aware of rat infestations became tense, restless, and prone to error. Sleep was fitful, meals were guarded, and vigilance was constant. Troops that might have been disciplined and effective under normal conditions often faltered when compounded by anxiety over the unseen intruders in their camp. Chroniclers from the period note the stress and fear caused by nocturnal scurrying, and the subtle ways this impacted morale and coordination. In effect, rats became silent advisors to human enemies, contributing to lapses in judgment, weakened defenses, and the erosion of human willpower, all without lifting a paw in combat. Rats also influenced the timing and execution of military campaigns. Supply lines were delayed or disrupted, forcing commanders to reconsider movements, pauses, or advances. When grain was lost or spoiled, or when disease struck soldiers indirectly through fleas carried by rats, entire operations could be postponed or cancelled. Siege preparations were undermined, ambushes rendered less effective, and battle plans adjusted to account for weakened forces. While generals could plan for human variables, the unpredictable presence of rats introduced a hidden element of chaos into even the most carefully organized campaigns. In this sense, the creatures were invisible participants, their impact subtle yet decisive, reshaping strategy from the shadows. Even the design of fortifications was affected indirectly by rat behavior. Strongholds had to store provisions safely, leading to raised granaries, sealed storage rooms, and strategic placement of supplies. Castles and forts incorporated lessons learned from observing how rats moved, adapted, and accessed food. Defensive measures, such as elevated platforms or storage in more secure rooms, reflected a deep, if unintended, understanding of rodent behavior. In effect, rats taught medieval architects and commanders valuable lessons in logistics, risk management, and the interplay between environment and strategy. They were unacknowledged instructors, demonstrating that even the smallest creatures could shape the thinking and practices of powerful humans. Historical accounts provide vivid examples of this influence. Chronicles from prolonged campaigns detail how entire units suffered from shortages and disease, while others flourished simply due to better management of provisions, or by chance avoidance of rat infestation. The loss of a critical granary or the spoilage of supplies due to persistent gnawing could determine the outcome of a campaign. Fleas-riding rats carried pathogens that spread illness silently, reducing combat effectiveness without the enemy ever firing a shot. Commanders might credit their victories or failures to skill, bravery, or divine favor, yet the hidden hand of rats and their parasites quietly shaped the fate of battles, sieges, and empires alike. The relationship between human military strategy and rat behavior also extended to naval campaigns. Ships transporting soldiers and supplies were often infested, with rats gnawing ropes, sails, and food stores. Fleas added another layer of risk, spreading disease among crews. Naval planners faced similar challenges to their land-based counterparts, maintaining provisions, preserving troop strength, and ensuring readiness for engagement. The unpredictable movement of rats could compromise even the most well-prepared voyages. These microscopic strategists operated without coordination, yet their cumulative effect on military outcomes was profound. Human ingenuity met the raw persistence of nature, with results that often defied expectation. Rats' influence was further compounded by their role in shaping human adaptation. Soldiers, aware of the threat, developed measures to counteract their effects. Grain was stored in barrels, kitchens elevated, and animals trained to hunt rodents. Camps were reorganized to reduce exposure, and vigilance became a constant requirement. Yet these adaptations were reactive, responding to the persistent ingenuity of the rats themselves. Every human innovation prompted counter-adaptation, creating an ongoing dialogue between people and creatures that subtly guided military practice and strategic thought. In essence, rats indirectly taught lessons in preparation, flexibility, and resilience, fundamental elements of successful strategy. In some campaigns, this hidden influence was so pronounced that it determined the outcome. Units weakened by infestation, disease, or food loss were unable to perform effectively, surrendering advantages to opponents who might have been equally matched. Commanders unaware of these invisible pressures misattributed success or failure to luck or skill, failing to recognize the true dynamics at play. Chroniclers occasionally noted mysterious shortages or sudden sickness without understanding the full cause, leaving modern historians to interpret the role of rats with the benefit of ecological and epidemiological knowledge. These accounts reveal the invisible architecture of strategy, built not only by humans but also by creatures acting according to instinct. Even when rats were controlled to some extent, their influence persisted. Fleas continued to transmit disease, minor gnawing went unnoticed until damage became critical, and psychological pressure lingered. Troops remained aware of vulnerability, affecting decisions and morale. The invisible presence of rats became a constant, shaping behavior, planning, and the execution of strategy across campaigns. Medieval generals, focused on human and logistical variables, often overlooked this quiet participant, yet its effects were measurable, significant, and enduring. Rats, through their persistence and adaptability, demonstrated that the smallest actors could alter the trajectory of large-scale historical events. Ultimately, the story of rats as hidden architects of medieval strategy underscores a broader truth: history is rarely shaped solely by human intent. The fortunes of armies, the success of sieges, and the outcomes of battles were influenced as much by unseen, persistent natural forces as by swords, spears, and tactical genius. Rats, acting without consciousness or malice, became partners in shaping human decisions, subtly guiding outcomes in ways that were profound, enduring, and historically significant. Their role reminds us that the interplay between humans and the natural world has always been central to the course of history, often in ways overlooked by contemporaries but crucial to understanding the past. In the quiet of besieged fortresses and crowded towns, fear often arrived unannounced, carried not by soldiers or invaders, but by the soft, scuttling presence of rats. These creatures, small and unassuming, had the extraordinary ability to influence human psychology in profound ways. The constant awareness that food could be stolen, supplies spoiled, and fleas carried disease created a subtle but relentless mental strain. Human minds, already under the stress of scarcity, illness, and the pressures of survival, were further burdened by the unpredictable, omnipresent activity of rats moving in hidden corners, gnawing silently, and reminding inhabitants that control was never absolute. Sleep, a precious refuge for soldiers and townsfolk alike, became fragmented. Nights were punctuated by the faint scratching along floorboards, the occasional rustle in the shadows, or the unmistakable gnawing on provisions. Even when the threat seemed minor, anticipation amplified its effect. Sleep deprivation eroded patience, dulled judgment, and heightened irritability. Soldiers, unable to rest fully, faced slower reaction times, reduced coordination, and a creeping sense of vulnerability. Families confined within walls struggled to comfort children frightened by scuttling noises, while adults worried over the slow depletion of food. Rats, through these subtle mechanisms, became instruments of psychological pressure, affecting decisions, morale, and human resilience in ways far greater than their physical presence might suggest. Chroniclers often noted the exhaustion and anxiety that accompanied prolonged sieges, attributing it to hunger, disease, and relentless human conflict. Yet the hidden role of rats in shaping this mental landscape cannot be understated. Their constant activity created a background tension, a persistent reminder that danger existed in even the most familiar spaces. Markets, kitchens, and storage rooms became sites of vigilance, with individuals forced to guard not only against human threats but against these tireless, small intruders. Anxiety, once activated, persisted in cycles. Sleepless nights, fraught days, and diminished morale created a feedback loop in which fear compounded the already severe pressures of medieval life. Rats were particularly effective in exacerbating fatigue because their presence was constant and unpredictable. Unlike human adversaries, who acted according to strategy and could be observed, anticipated, and countered, rats moved according to instinct, slipping through gaps, gnawing in hidden corners, and contaminating supplies without warning. Soldiers and townsfolk could prepare for human attacks, but these tiny, persistent creatures were ever-shifting, evading detection, and exploiting even minor lapses in vigilance. The human response, heightened attention, repeated inspection of supplies, and constant scanning of sleeping quarters, created a mental load that compounded physical exhaustion. In this way, rats participated in psychological warfare without any conscious intent, demonstrating that even small creatures could wield outsized influence over human behavior. Fear was amplified by the knowledge that rats carried disease. Fleas, invisible to the eye, spread pathogens with a subtle efficiency that humans could neither predict nor prevent. The specter of plague, fever, or dysentery loomed in the background, heightening stress and anxiety. People became hyper-aware of cleanliness, rationing, and proximity to contaminated areas. This vigilance, while necessary, increased mental strain and affected social behavior. Families isolated themselves, children became anxious, and soldiers fretted over seemingly minor exposures that could have catastrophic consequences. Rats, as vectors of disease, acted as unseen agents shaping the emotional and psychological environment of communities under siege. Historical accounts from besieged towns and military campaigns illustrate the psychological impact vividly. Chroniclers described soldiers retreating to sleep in fear of scurrying noises, townsfolk refusing to touch spilled grain, and communities living in constant tension over food stores. Anxiety became a structural element of life during sieges. Even when supplies remained sufficient, the knowledge of rats' relentless activity imposed a cognitive burden. Every task, from cooking to rationing to moving supplies, required attention to detail far beyond ordinary circumstances. The presence of these creatures transformed daily routines into exercises in caution, further amplifying fatigue and stress across populations. Psychological warfare extended to communal dynamics. Fear and vigilance often created tension among neighbors and within families. Trust, essential for cooperation, was strained when provisions were stolen, gnawed, or contaminated. Accusations of negligence or carelessness could escalate minor infractions into social conflict. Rats, operating silently, indirectly influenced human relationships by introducing stressors that tested patience, cohesion, and empathy. Communities were compelled to adapt, developing new social norms, rotational watch systems, and strategies to mitigate the mental toll imposed by persistent threats. The creature's indirect effects extended far beyond individual households, shaping communal behavior and resilience under duress. Commanders and leaders, aware of the mental strain caused by rat infestations, sometimes adjusted strategies accordingly. Troop rotations, rest schedules, and food allocations were designed with the recognition that soldiers' effectiveness was compromised by anxiety and fatigue. However, these adaptations were often reactive rather than proactive, as the full scope of the threat was poorly understood. Rats, through their continuous, unpredictable presence, effectively imposed constraints on human decision-making, influencing strategic planning without a conscious plan or intention. They became silent partners in warfare, their subtle actions shaping outcomes in ways that were rarely acknowledged in contemporary accounts. Rats also served as constant reminders of human vulnerability. In an environment where fortifications, weapons, and strategies could be meticulously planned, these small intruders operated independently, immune to the grand designs of humans. Their scurrying, gnawing, and contamination highlighted the limits of human control, fostering a humbling awareness of mortality, scarcity, and the unpredictability of life. This persistent tension influenced not only morale but also decision-making under pressure. Leaders, knowing that troops were anxious, had to consider the psychological state of their forces when planning engagements, rationing supplies, or organizing defense, integrating the invisible presence of rats into broader strategic thinking. The cumulative effect of rats on human psychology was profound. Sleep-deprived, anxious, and constantly vigilant, populations under siege were vulnerable not only to disease and starvation but also to poor judgment, impulsive decisions, and diminished resilience. Chroniclers provide numerous examples of armies faltering, towns mismanaging supplies, and individuals making desperate choices under the compounded pressures of hunger, illness, and mental strain. Rats, through their simple, instinctual behaviors, became unacknowledged architects of human vulnerability, influencing the course of events in ways that extended far beyond physical damage or resource loss. Even in post-siege periods, the psychological effects persisted. Survivors, haunted by nights of scuttling and gnawing, remained vigilant against future infestations. Fear became ingrained, shaping behaviors around storage, cleanliness, and vigilance for generations. Communities adapted to minimize exposure, integrating lessons learned into cultural practices, architecture, and daily routines. The invisible presence of rats had left an enduring mark on human psychology, illustrating that history is shaped not only by overt actions but also by subtle, persistent, and often invisible forces operating quietly alongside human activity. The legacy of rats in medieval history extends far beyond the immediate destruction of food supplies, the spread of disease, or the disruption of military campaigns. Their presence, persistent and silent, left traces that shaped human understanding, cultural memory, and historical interpretation. In chronicles, folk tales, and even legal records, rats emerge as both literal and symbolic figures, embodying fear, scarcity, and the unpredictable power of nature. Though invisible to the architects of fortresses or the commanders of armies, rats' influence was profound, shaping not only the events of their time but the way those events would be remembered and understood for generations. In written records, chroniclers often framed rats as omens or instruments of divine will. Their scurrying through granaries or fortresses, appearing at moments of crisis, was interpreted as a sign of impending misfortune. Monks, scribes, and historians described infestations with vivid language, emphasizing their relentless activity and the despair they wrought. Such accounts reveal a dual perception. Rats were both practical nuisances, capable of materially affecting food and health, and symbolic agents, representing the fragility of human life and the inexorable presence of mortality. Their narrative role underscores the way humans have historically interpreted natural phenomena through cultural, moral, and spiritual lenses. Folktales and oral histories further amplified the symbolic role of rats. Across Europe, stories circulated about rats appearing before sieges, spreading disease, or guiding the outcomes of battles. These tales often attributed near-intentional intelligence or purpose to the creatures, reflecting both the mystery of their unseen actions and the human need to explain the unexplainable. Children were warned of their danger, and adults recounted anecdotes of miraculous escapes or devastating losses linked to infestations. The stories, though embellished, captured the psychological impact of rats, illustrating how these small creatures became embedded in the collective memory as agents capable of influencing fate. Legal and municipal records from the period also attest to the enduring impact of rats. Regulations concerning the storage of grain, the construction of granaries, and the maintenance of cleanliness were enacted in response to infestations. Town councils, aware that rats could disrupt both economic stability and public health, issued ordinances designed to mitigate their effects. These laws reveal an early form of public health intervention, born not from scientific understanding of pathogens but from observation of outcomes, spoiled grain, disease, and social unrest. In this sense, rats indirectly shaped governance, prompting communities to formalize strategies for managing both natural and human resources in ways that would resonate for centuries. The broader historical consequences are evident when examining population movements and urban development. Towns repeatedly afflicted by rat infestations, combined with plague or famine, sometimes experience depopulation or shifts in settlement patterns. Survivors migrated to less affected areas, bringing knowledge of the risks, preventive measures, and cultural practices necessary to avoid repeated devastation. This movement of people, in response to the dual pressures of ecological and social stresses, reshaped regional demographics, trade networks, and urban planning. Rats, operating invisibly, were thus active participants in the transformation of human geography and social organization during the medieval period. In the realm of medicine, rats indirectly influenced the evolution of understanding about disease. Observations of patterns of illness, often linked to proximity to infested areas or contaminated supplies, contributed to rudimentary theories of contagion. Although germ theory would not emerge for centuries, the repeated association of rats with plague and illness provided early insight into the relationship between environment, disease vectors, and human health. Physicians and apothecaries, while largely limited in their ability to intervene, were forced to consider the unseen dynamics of contagion, laying a conceptual foundation for later scientific discovery. Rats, unknowing and unintentional, became unwitting teachers of epidemiology. The cultural representation of rats also evolved over time. In art, literature, and theatre, they appeared as symbols of decay, cunning, and resilience. Medieval manuscripts sometimes depicted rats gnawing at grain stores or spreading chaos, reinforcing their role as cautionary figures. Later literary traditions continued this portrayal, casting rats as both real threats and metaphorical representations of societal vulnerabilities. This enduring cultural imprint highlights the unique position of rats. They were at once tangible actors shaping historical events and enduring symbols in human imagination, bridging the gap between material reality and narrative interpretation. Furthermore, rats' legacy is evident in modern historiography. Scholars examining medieval sieges, famines, and epidemics now recognize the central role these creatures played in shaping outcomes. Where once chroniclers attributed failure solely to poor leadership, divine wrath, or human error, contemporary historians acknowledge the ecological and biological factors that mediated human experience. The presence of rats provides a lens through which to understand the complex interplay between environment, human behavior, and historical causality. Their story reminds us that history is rarely shaped exclusively by conscious human action. Rather, it emerges from the dynamic interactions of humans, animals, and the natural world. Rats also offer lessons in resilience and adaptation. Communities repeatedly affected by infestations developed strategies for food storage, sanitation, and pest control that informed broader societal practices. Even in the absence of scientific knowledge, people learned to anticipate and mitigate risks, demonstrating ingenuity in the face of persistent, invisible challenges. These adaptations highlight a form of practical intelligence shaped by observation, experience, and necessity, underscoring the capacity of humans to respond creatively to ecological pressures. In this way, rats indirectly fostered innovation, leaving a practical legacy intertwined with their more notorious historical impact. Perhaps most striking is the way rats exemplify the subtle, unseen forces that shape human destiny. Small, silent, and largely ignored, they moved through medieval life with profound consequences. They influenced military outcomes, economic patterns, social behavior, and cultural memory. They taught lessons in vigilance, adaptation, and the limits of human control. In understanding the legacy of rats, we gain insight not only into medieval history but also into broader principles of historical causation, ecological interconnectedness, and the enduring influence of the smallest actors in complex systems. Their story is a reminder that history is often written as much by the unseen as by the visible. Ultimately, the tale of rats in medieval Europe is one of paradox, creatures despised and feared, yet inextricably linked to human survival, adaptation, and memory. Their presence was destructive, yet it prompted learning. Their gnawing spread disease, yet it led to innovations in storage and sanitation. Their stealth shaped fear, yet it also reinforced resilience. In recognizing this duality, we come to appreciate the nuanced ways in which seemingly insignificant forces shape the grand sweep of history. Rats were more than pests. They were silent architects, teachers, and symbols, leaving a legacy that echoes through time, memory, and scholarship. In the dim corridors of medieval life, where fortresses rose against sieges and towns huddled behind wooden gates, the presence of rats was more than a mere nuisance. These creatures, moving silently in the shadows, exemplified the subtle yet profound ways nature could shape human existence. They gnawed through grain sacks, infested kitchens, and carried disease with remarkable efficiency, but their influence went far beyond these tangible effects. The lessons they imparted, often unrecognized, yet deeply impactful, were lessons in vigilance, adaptation, resilience, and humility. Through their quiet persistence, rats became inadvertent teachers, showing humanity the limitations of control and the importance of understanding the unseen forces that govern life. Medieval communities quickly learned that survival depended on anticipating the activities of these small intruders. Grain storage evolved from simple sacks on the ground to elevated platforms and sealed barrels. Kitchens were monitored closely, and domestic animals, such as cats, were strategically employed to keep populations in check. Every innovation reflected an intimate understanding of rat behavior, born not from theoretical knowledge but from careful observation and practical necessity. These adaptations reveal that humans, even in a world constrained by limited technology and understanding, were capable of responding creatively to ecological pressures. In this sense, rats became unintentional instructors, teaching lessons in strategic thinking, risk management, and resourcefulness. The influence of rats also extended to social organization. families and communities developed routines designed to minimize exposure and reduce losses. Rotational watches were established to guard granaries, and communal storage practices were modified to account for the persistent threat. The need for cooperation and coordination became apparent, as individuals who ignored vigilance risked not only personal loss but also the well-being of neighbors. Rats, by disrupting resources and creating uncertainty, indirectly reinforced social cohesion, emphasizing the importance of collective action in the face of persistent, invisible challenges. They shaped not only material outcomes but also human relationships and social norms. In military contexts, the lessons were equally profound. Commanders learned that the smallest factors could tip the balance of campaigns. Troops weakened by infestation, disease, or scarcity required new strategies for rationing, defense, and morale management. Planners began to integrate environmental factors into their calculations, recognizing that successful campaigns depended not only on human skill but also on anticipating the influence of nature and unseen agents. Rats, in their silent persistence, highlighted the necessity of considering all variables, no matter how small, in the complex equation of survival and victory. Their presence transformed strategy from a purely human endeavor into a dialogue with the environment itself. The economic lessons were similarly far-reaching. Merchants and townspeople realized that controlling rat populations was essential to maintaining trade, preserving food security, and sustaining livelihoods. This awareness led to the development of early pest management techniques, from improved storage design to the use of predators and traps. Each adaptation represented an incremental advance in understanding and controlling the relationship between humans and the natural world. Rats, acting according to instinct, drove innovation and informed practices that would persist long after individual infestations had subsided. Their impact demonstrates the intricate feedback loop between ecological forces and human ingenuity. Psychologically, rats reinforced the value of attentiveness and prudence. Individuals who ignored signs of infestation or took resources for granted faced tangible consequences. The gnawing on a sack of grain or the spread of disease reminded communities that vigilance was essential for survival. Over time, these experiences shaped cultural practices, emphasizing careful stewardship, preparedness, and respect for the natural forces that could not be fully controlled. Rats, in this sense, functioned as subtle moral instructors, illustrating the consequences of negligence and the rewards of foresight, patience, and diligence. The symbolic role of rats also contributed to their enduring influence. Chroniclers, storytellers, and artists depicted rats as embodiments of threat, adaptability, and the unpredictability of life. Their omnipresence in narratives of famine, plague, and war reinforced their position as both literal and metaphorical agents of change. Through these stories, rats became symbols of the delicate balance between human ambition and the uncontrollable elements of nature. They were reminders that even in the midst of human effort, mastery over the environment was never absolute, and that awareness, preparation, and adaptability were essential virtues in a world shaped by both seen and unseen forces. The interplay between humans and rats offers broader lessons about history itself. Major events, plagues, sieges, economic disruptions, cannot be understood solely in terms of human decisions or technological capabilities. Unseen factors, whether ecological, biological, or environmental, play decisive roles in shaping outcomes. Rats serve as a vivid example of this principle, demonstrating that small, persistent forces can influence the course of civilizations in ways that are often invisible, underappreciated, or misunderstood at the time. By studying their impact, we gain a more nuanced understanding of how history unfolds, recognizing the interdependence of human action and natural processes. Even today, the legacy of these medieval lessons persists. Modern urban planning, public health, and agricultural practices owe much to the adaptive strategies first developed in response to persistent infestations. Elevated storage, pest management protocols, and attention to sanitation trace their origins to the hard-earned experience of medieval communities learning to coexist with rats. In this way, the humble rat has influenced human society not only in the past but also in shaping principles and practices that endure into the present. Their story demonstrates that historical influence is not limited to kings, generals, or scholars, sometimes it comes from the quiet, persistent forces that operate beyond human perception. Finally, the narrative of rats in medieval history underscores a broader philosophical truth. Human control is always partial, and survival often depends on humility, adaptability, and respect for the forces of nature. The creatures, moving silently through granaries and fortresses, remind us that even the smallest actors can wield profound influence. Their presence shaped military outcomes, economic systems, social organization, psychological states, and cultural memory. In understanding and responding to these influences, humans demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and foresight. The lessons from the shadows are timeless. Success requires observation, adaptation, and an appreciation for the interconnectedness of all living systems. The legacy of rats is therefore twofold, practical and symbolic. Practically, they forced innovations in storage, defense, and communal organization. Symbolically, they represented the unpredictable and uncontrollable aspects of life, teaching lessons in vigilance, foresight, and humility. Medieval society, through experience and adaptation, internalized these lessons, creating structures, routines, and cultural narratives designed to mitigate risk and foster resilience. The presence of rats, once seen only as a threat, ultimately became a source of learning, shaping both material practices and collective understanding. Through their persistent, unseen influence, they left a lasting mark on history. In conclusion, the lessons from the shadows reveal the quiet but transformative power of small, persistent forces. Rats, operating without intention, reshaped human behavior, institutions, and collective memory. They exemplify the ways in which the natural world can guide, challenge, and instruct humanity. Medieval communities, in responding to these challenges, demonstrated the capacity for innovation, resilience, and adaptive learning. The story of rats is a testament to the enduring interplay between humans and the natural environment, reminding us that history is rarely written by human effort alone. Instead, it is co-authored by all the actors, seen and unseen, who shape the unfolding narrative of civilization.